All right, strap yourselves in for today's deep dive because we are flying straight into the heart of U.S. politics. President-elect Trump's latest appointments have got everybody talking, and especially when it comes to immigration. So we're going to unpack what these picks actually tell us about what's coming down the road. No media spin, just the facts and some expert analysis to help you connect all the dots.
Exactly. We've got quite a few news articles here, a whole stack, and we're going to sift through all that noise and get you the insights that you need. We'll be checking out familiar faces, maybe some surprises, and looking at what it all means for the future of immigration here in the U.S.
Okay, sounds good. First up, we've got a familiar name returning to the White House, Stephen Miller as Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy. So this isn't his first time in the White House, is it?
Definitely not. Miller was a major figure in Trump's first term, shaping a lot of the administration's approach to immigration. He was actually a central figure in that 2018 policy that separated families at the border.
Wow. Okay, so this is someone who definitely has a strong track record and pretty controversial one at that. What's he been up to since leaving the White House?
Well, since then, he's been leading America First Legal, and that's an organization that's been challenging the Biden administration on issues like freedom of speech, religion, and you guessed it, national security. He's been keeping busy, you could say.
So he's been building a whole platform around these ideas, and I'm thinking that experience is definitely going to influence how he tackles this new role, right? What kind of influence do you think he'll have?
Well, that's a great question. You see, the Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy has a hand in developing legislation, developing executive orders, and advising the president. So Miller is in a position to impact, a wide range of policy areas. But considering his background, you can bet immigration will be a top priority.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, now let's talk about someone who's going to be even more directly involved with immigration. Talking about Tom Homan as the Border Czar. I mean, that title alone sounds like something out of a movie.
Yeah, it's got that dramatic flair to it. This position gives Homan a lot of authority over immigration enforcement and deportations. And here's where it gets interesting. This role doesn't require Senate confirmation, so Trump has a lot of direct control here.
Wow, that's pretty different. So it bypasses a lot of the usual checks and balances. That's a bold move. So tell me, what's Homan's story?
Well, Homan has been in the immigration enforcement world for over 30 years, working his way up through ICE under multiple administrations. He even served as acting director of ICE during Trump's first term.
Okay, so he's not just some random appointment. He's got serious experience.
Yeah.
What kind of policies did he put in place during his time as acting director? What was his approach?
Well, he oversaw a significant increase in immigrant arrests, almost 40% higher compared to the year before. And this wasn't just focused on people with criminal records. Homan expanded enforcement priorities to target all undocumented immigrants, which was a major shift in approach.
That does sound like a pretty big change. But he also earned some serious recognition during the Obama administration, right?
That's right. Homan actually received the Presidential Rank Award for Distinguished Service from President Obama back in 2015.
Wow, interesting. So we're talking about someone who's worked under both Democratic and Republican presidents and clearly has a deep understanding of immigration policy.
Exactly. And speaking of complicated, let's talk about the zero tolerance policy that Homan was a big proponent of.
Yeah, that one really made headlines and not in a good way. It led to families being separated at the border, didn't it?
It did. The zero tolerance policy meant that anyone caught crossing the border illegally, including those seeking asylum, faced criminal prosecution. And the problem was children couldn't be held in federal jail with their parents, so thousands of families were separated.
So you had parents being detained and prosecuted while their kids were placed in separate facilities. I can definitely see why that caused such a massive outcry.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It sparked international condemnation, with many people criticizing the policy as cruel and inhumane. Eventually, a court order forced the reunification of families, but the trauma inflicted was undeniable.
It's a stark reminder of the real-world consequences of these policies, especially for the most vulnerable. It'll be interesting to see how this part of his history plays out in this new role. Did Homan ever express regret or acknowledge the trauma caused by the family separations?
While he defended the policy's intent to deter illegal immigration, he did say that separating families wasn't the intended outcome. He maintained that the goal was to enforce the law and discourage illegal border crossings, not to punish families.
That's a tough line to walk. It's hard to imagine that such a drastic policy wouldn't have serious consequences for families caught in the middle.
You're hitting on a really crucial point. It raises those big questions about the balance between enforcing immigration laws and protecting the well-being of vulnerable individuals.
Okay, so let's recap. We've got Stephen Miller, a key figure in Trump's first term on immigration, now back in a position to influence policy across the board. And we've got Tom Homan, who spearheaded a more aggressive approach to enforcement, now in charge of border security. I'm sensing a theme here.
I think you're picking up on something important. Both Miller and Homan are known for their hardline stances on immigration. Their appointments definitely signal a potential shift back towards the stricter, and some might say more controversial, enforcement strategies we saw during Trump's first term.
That's a big takeaway for our listener to consider. So what are some of the key things we should be watching for as we try to understand what these appointments really mean for the future of immigration?
Well, for starters, keep an eye out for any new initiatives or executive orders related to immigration in the coming months. It'll be fascinating to see how these appointments translate into actual policy changes, especially considering the controversy that surrounded some of their previous actions.
For sure. And I'm curious about how public opinion and different advocacy groups are going to respond to these developments. This is definitely going to be a hot-button issue.
Absolutely. It's going to be interesting to see how various groups react to these appointments. We know that immigration is a complex issue with strong opinions on all sides.
Okay, before we move on, let's take a quick step back and look at some of the specific policies that Homan implemented during his time as acting director of ICE. What were some of the major changes he made?
One of the biggest changes was that expansion of enforcement priorities we talked about earlier. Under Homan's leadership, ICE wasn't just focusing on deporting undocumented immigrants with criminal records. He directed them to target all undocumented immigrants, which was a significant departure from the approach of previous administrations.
So essentially anyone who was undocumented was at risk of deportation.
Essentially, yes. He famously said that undocumented immigrants should be afraid under the Trump administration. And you can imagine how that statement created a wave of fear and uncertainty in those communities.
Wow, that's a pretty strong message. Did this lead to a significant increase in deportations?
Yes, there was a notable spike in immigrant arrests during Homan's tenure, almost a 40% increase compared to the year before. This was fueled by more aggressive tactics like workplace raids and community arrests, which really ramped up the pressure.
Workplace raids. That sounds pretty disruptive.
It can be. These raids involved ICE agents entering businesses and checking the immigration status of employees. And it's not just about the individual workers. These raids can have ripple effects throughout entire communities.
It sounds like there were some pretty serious consequences. Did any government entities or advocacy groups push back against these policies?
Oh, absolutely. Homan's approach faced strong criticism from various groups. Critics argued that his policies were overly aggressive, inhumane, and unfairly targeted vulnerable populations. There were even legal challenges to some of his policies, particularly the zero-tolerance policy and the family separations that resulted from it.
It's interesting how, even within the government, there can be so much disagreement on how to approach something as complex as immigration. It seems like this Border Czar position was practically created for someone like Homan, given his history and approach.
It's hard to disagree with that. The Border Czar has a lot of leeway to implement the president's agenda, and Homan's views on immigration seem very much aligned with Trump's. From the administration's perspective, he's probably a perfect fit.
So to sum it up for our listener, both of these appointments, Miller and Homan, seem to indicate that immigration is going to be front and center in Trump's second term. And it looks like we're going to see a return to some of those controversial hardline policies from his first term.
That's a fair assessment. And considering the strong personalities and past actions of both Miller and Homan, we can probably expect a lot of debate and potentially even some legal challenges along the way. It's definitely going to be an area to watch closely in the coming months.
Absolutely. And for our listener, it's important to stay informed and to understand the potential impact of these policies, both on individuals and on the broader society.
I agree. This isn't just about politics, it's about people's lives. It's about understanding the human stories behind the headlines and engaging in thoughtful discussions about what kind of future we want to create.
All right, I think we've covered a lot of ground already. Let's take a quick pause here, and we'll come back in part 2 to dig even deeper into these appointments and their potential consequences.